When money becomes unreliable, families don't abandon economics, they replace it. Across wars, depressions, and currency collapses, households learned that food was not just sustenance but stored labor, stored purchasing power, and stored time. For families living close to the edge, especially during prolonged crises, food storage quietly replaced banks, wages, and even cash itself. This guide focuses on how that system actually worked, how it protected families financially, and how the same logic still applies today for anyone serious about survival and resilience. Food storage functioned as a parallel savings account. Families treated stored food the way we treat money in an account today. Grain in a bin, beans in a sack, smoked meat in a loft, and jars of preserved vegetables represented hours of labor already paid for. Once stored, that labor no longer had to be repurchased with scarce cash. Every meal pulled from storage was a meal not bought, a coin not spent, and a day of income preserved for emergencies. This is why food storage expanded during economic collapse even when people were poorer. They were not wasting resources. They were locking value in a form that inflation, wage cuts, or bank failures could not touch. A family that stored a winter's worth of staples effectively froze their food costs. When prices rose or supply vanished, they were insulated. This was especially critical in rural and working-class households where income was irregular. If work disappeared for weeks, food storage bridged the gap without forcing debt, asset sales, or migration. Staple foods were chosen for economic density, not taste. Families focused on foods that delivered the highest calories, nutrition, and shelf life per unit of cost and labor. Grain was king because it stored compactly, fed both humans and livestock, and could be converted into bread, porridge, or animal feed. Beans followed closely, providing protein that meat could not reliably supply year-round. Root vegetables were favored because they stored in cellars without fuel or technology. Preserved fats such as lard and rendered tallow were treated like strategic assets because calories without fat quickly failed in hard labor conditions. This wasn't about culinary preference, not at all. It was accounting, plain and simple. Families would figure out just how long a certain amount of stored food could keep everyone working and healthy. A full granary, well, that meant folks could keep on being productive. But if it was empty, you'd be forced to rely on credit or sometimes charity. These days, the same rule still applies. If you're storing food to protect your finances, you really want to focus on foods that help shield you from price spikes and sudden drops in income. Rice, dried beans, flour, cooking oil, and preserved proteins, they're still just as important as they were 100 years ago. Preservation methods. They helped folks rely less on cash. It wasn't about making things convenient. It was about staying away from the market as much as possible. Drying, smoking, fermenting, salting, and canning let families turn a big harvest into security that lasted all year. When the garden gave more than you could eat fresh, nothing went to waste because letting food spoil was pretty much the same as burning money. Well, canning really transformed surplus produce into shelf-stable meals that could replace store purchases for months down the road. Fermentation, on the other hand, turned vegetables into preserved nutrition, and you didn't even need to spend on fuel for that. Smoking and salting meat, that just flat-out eliminated the need to buy protein during winter, when prices were at their highest. Each preserved item honestly represented a future transaction that you just didn't have to make. For modern survivalists, this principle still holds true. Preserving your own food isn't just a hobby. It's really about prepaying future meals at today's prices. Now, a freezer outage can wipe out that value in a heartbeat, but shelf-stable preservation, well, it protects it indefinitely. One of the quieter advantages of food storage was leverage. Families with full pantries, they just didn't panic during short-term unemployment or medical crises. They could hold off on borrowing, negotiate better terms, or sometimes avoid loans altogether. Hunger, it forces folks into bad financial decisions. But stored food, it buys time, and time, well, it just plain improves outcomes. During economic collapses, lenders, well, they often targeted the desperate. Families with food reserves were less likely to mortgage their land, sell off tools, or accept those exploitative labor contracts. They could wait for conditions to improve, while others, unfortunately, were forced into permanent losses. These days, emergency food plays the same role. It helps reduce reliance on high-interest credit cards, payday loans, or, being forced to liquidate assets. Food storage isn't separate from financial planning. It's really a foundational layer of it. In many hard periods, food just directly replaced money. Eggs, flour, cured meat, and preserved vegetables were traded for services, repairs, or other goods. Unlike cash, food was universally useful and trusted. Its value was obvious and, immediate. Families who stored food could participate in informal economies even when formal ones collapsed. A sack of grain could be traded for veterinary help. A jar of preserved meat could pay for mechanical repairs. This barter economy functioned because food had predictable utility and limited spoilage. This remains relevant in modern disruptions. In localized crises, food often becomes the first acceptable trade item. Those who understand this treat storage not only as insurance, but as optional liquidity. Protecting food meant protecting money. Families invested labor into proper storage because spoilage was financial loss. Cellars were designed for airflow and temperature stability. Grain bins were elevated and sealed against moisture and rodents. Jars were inspected regularly. Stocks were rotated deliberately. Nothing was left to chance. Even small losses mattered, A spoiled barrel of flour could mean hunger or forced spending later on. This attention to detail is why historical food systems appear meticulous rather than casual. Applying this today means thinking beyond simply owning supplies. Storage conditions, rotation, and redundancy really matter. Food that spoils is not stored wealth, it's just delayed waste. Food security allowed families to keep working rather than scrambling. When nutrition declined, productivity collapsed. A well-fed household could maintain physical strength, mental clarity, and morale. That translated directly into earning potential when opportunities returned. Children could actually remain in school rather than being sent to work prematurely, and adults, they could choose jobs instead of just accepting the first one that comes along. So food storage, in a roundabout way, really did help protect those long-term economic prospects. Now, this is something that's often overlooked in modern survival thinking. Food isn't just about survival calories. It's about preserving your capacity. If a household eats poorly during stressful times, they're bound to make poorer decisions and, honestly, miss out on opportunities. Ultimately, stored food returned control to families. They were, less dependent on employers, merchants, lenders, and governments. This autonomy really mattered deeply in times when institutions failed or, exploited scarcity. Families who mastered food storage were not wealthy, but they sure were resilient. They converted labor and foresight into stability. They understood that money was only one form of value and, honestly, not the most reliable one. For modern viewers of Battlefield of Survival, this lesson is just timeless. Building food reserves is not nostalgia, it is strategy. It protects income, reduces risk, and, restores agency. If this guide added value to your understanding of historical survival economics, go ahead and subscribe to Battlefield of Survival for more serious, research-driven content. Share this with someone who thinks preparedness is only about gear, not systems. History rewards those who study it closely.